Welcome to Category Visionaries, the show dedicated to exploring exciting visions for the future from the founders who are on the front lines building it. In each episode, we'll speak with a visionary founder who's building a new category or reimagining an existing one. We'll learn about the problem they solve, how their technology works, and unpack their vision for the future. I'm your host, Brett Stapper, CEO of Frontlines Media. Now let's dive right into today's episode. Hey, founders, and thanks for listening. Today I'm speaking with Beck Besecker, CEO and founder of Marxent, a 3D product experience platform that's raised over $44 million in funding. Beck, thanks for chatting with me today.
Oh, thank you for your time, Brett.
Super excited for our conversation. Now, to kick things off, can we maybe just start with a quick summary of who you are and a bit more about your background?
Sure. My background is very tightly intertwined with my brother, Barry, who's my lifelong CTO. And this is our third or fourth company together, losing track. You know, we're lifelong entrepreneurs. We sort of grew up in the, kind of started in business in the late 90s, early 2000s when the first sort of round of internet enabled businesses. And so we've always been, at that time it was like ASP, but we've always been in around sort of the hosted cloud-based content management space and sort of have moved from different industries that were in need of sort of moving from traditional sort of desktop experiences into a sort of a modern cloud-based customer experience.
Now, looking at your LinkedIn, I see that first company, it looks like that was Copient in 1999, and then you ended up selling that in 2006. So that must have been a pretty interesting time to be in tech. When did the bubble burst? Was that 2000, 2001?
2001. Yeah, we started that. So that was I went to Purdue for a long time. I think I was in school 10 years or something like that. But I got a job in like the fundraising office there, helping them with sort of like a big data project the goal was to figure out if they was going to go raise $1 billion in a funding campaign, who should they target amongst their alumni population, if you will. Which is pretty cool because Neil Armstrong was actually like the chair of the campaign. It's like a big $1 billion campaign to grow the university. So I was a graduate student in finance, and that got me into a big data and segmentation and targeting and lookalike models to try to understand prospects. And so what that got me into was this idea of differentiated marketing, and email was only a few years old at the time. So the thesis of our first business was, geez, if you can send out a marketing message at no variable cost, you could be a lot more efficient with your advertising dollars, which is kind of funny to say now, right? Because that's what we all do. And so our thesis for the first business was, hey, all these emerging online companies, Amazon, Pets.com at the time, are all going to need a targeted marketing platform where you could differentiate messaging and do sequences and all the stuff people call it today. So the good news is we were sort of right about where this space would go, but the bad news was you just hit it on the head. All my clients were, .coms that couldn't pay anything at the end of the day. But we got kind of lucky in that what we were doing was also useful in the physical retail world. So, when you scan a loyalty card and you get offers on your receipt tape based on your current and previous purchase history, we're the guys that invented that. And so what we did is we took that differentiated marketing platform in the cloud and then connected it to the checkout in the store. So we would look at your purchase history, and then instead of having a hard-coded buy one, get one free, we could send that up to the cloud and decide, Brett, would like an offer on baby formula because we saw him previously buy diapers. And that's why we got bought by NCR, eventually became part of the backbone of NCR's loyalty marketing platform that's used in, thousands and thousands of retailers around the world. But it was a great experience. We probably raised $1.8 million for that company. We were 30 people or so when it sold. The moral of that story is things got tight on fundraising in 2001, right after 9/11. And so, we really were in a position where it was going to be hard to grow the business without additional financing, and things were pretty tight during that time. So, but ended up good. We sold to NCR, and I stayed there for 3 years, worked for Mark Hurd. Couldn't have been better. It's a great first, B2B SaaS experience, if you will.
Were you tempted to move to Silicon Valley at any point? Because it looks like that company was in Indiana.
So not to offend any of your listeners in California, but y'all got enough entrepreneurs. You don't need me. we part of our company ethos, both companies, actually all three companies, we kind of don't hire anybody from California because you guys got plenty of opportunity out there. Part of our mission is, really to help build these kind of businesses in the Midwest and, Florida and other places.
Amazing. Love that. Who inspires you when it comes to founders? Are there any founders that you've personally interacted with or worked with or partnered with in some way that just really inspired the way that you approach work?
Yeah, our dad was an entrepreneur. He had a sporting goods store. That's where we caught the bug. It was funny. Barry and I were talking about, we used to do inventory when we were like 7 and 8 years old, and he'd have us counting like golf tees. It wasn't until I was like in my 30s, I realized that was unnecessary. You're just keeping us busy. But my dad was really cool. He was always introducing us to business ideas. I got my first copyright when I was 7, which I was like so excited, but I had no idea what a copyright was. It's like a drawing he did for me and helped me with. And so first and foremost, dad. And then I'm a big biography guy. I love biographies, particularly around, I've read all the Rockefeller and Carnegie and JP Morgan, all this. It's just so interesting to me. And I'd say practically the people that have been really meaningful in my life, Dan Gilbert, who started Rocket Mortgage, who's one of the largest investors in our company today, Marxent. And that guy is a force of nature. He's just an amazing entrepreneur, great culture builder. We've patterned our entire culture, which I hope we get a chance to talk about today, off of Rocket Mortgage. And then I got another guy, it's a major investment company, Arnie Bellini, who started ConnectWise, sold to Thoma Bravo for $1 billion plus a couple years ago. I got a long list, actually. I've been inordinately blessed with founders who've been successful and been able to sort of put them in our circle of influence.
You mentioned biographies there. I'm a big biography reader. About 3 or 4 years ago, I just got burnt out and exhausted of reading business books. Seems like they all kind of said the same thing. So I've been going very deep into biographies.
I don't care for like the 5 steps to happiness type stuff. And, the formula, like that stuff just doesn't stick with me. But, biographies and stories, like the lessons embedded in those kind of stay with you. And I hate the pop culture, simple frameworks, Tony Robbins of business books. Not for me.
Have you heard of the podcast, The Founders?
I have. Yep. I have. I've listened a few times.
Yeah, I figured if you're into biographies, that's like a dream. I stumbled across that a few weeks ago. I was like, wow, this is going to take up a lot of content or a lot of time to get through all this. If you could meet any person from any of the biographies that you've read, obviously it doesn't matter if they're alive anymore, like who would that person be?
Let's see. I'm a Neil Armstrong fanatic. Like he grew up in Ohio and not too far away from like where my Barry and I grew up. The Wright brothers are like a big deal, in Dayton. And we always considered ourselves, we were pretty thick as thieves, Barry and I. So kind of thought of ourselves as the Wright brothers of whatever, inventors. And so, but Neil Armstrong was I grew up, I was born in 70, you still had a lot of the space race stuff going on in the 70s. I don't know if you're probably old enough to remember the show Bionic Man, Steve Austin. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of after Neil Armstrong. Yeah. So Neil Armstrong would be the guy I'd love to. So he's a Purdue grad. And a lot of people don't know that there's like 23 astronauts that went into space that went to Purdue. Very well-known program there. And so anyway, I, of course, knew of him. I'd read his books, learned about him in school. And so I'm working on this fundraising campaign. And I didn't know he was going to be the chair of this campaign. And I'm sitting inside the office of this like vice president of advancement. And there's this older guy sitting next to me, and he starts asking me all these questions. He's probably in his 70s. And he's like, what are you studying? And, how do you like school? Just like overly interested in like what I was doing or who I was. And I was kind of bothered because I was thinking about my interview. And then the receptionist said, Dr. Armstrong, you can go in now. I was like, you got to be shitting me. I couldn't believe it. I think about that. I use that story a lot about listening and asking questions because maybe the dumbest moment of my life, but it was pretty cool.
That's awesome. And yeah, that's what this podcast is all about, is hearing these types of stories. They're always fun. So appreciate you sharing that one. Now, I'd love to switch gears here and let's dive a bit deeper into the company. And how we like to begin this part of the interview is really talking about the problem. So at a high level, what problem is Marxent solving?
Okay, so if you're going to buy a high consideration product, like in the home category, which is where we're focused. So think kitchen, bath, a decking project, right? They're expensive. They have a lot of configurable parts that have to be put together in a shared scene. It's a complex data model. And if you're just an average Joe and you're on your first home and you're going to build your first kitchen and it's going to cost you 10, 15, 20,000, there are just not any really good tools, or weren't any really good tools out there that allowed the average homeowner or a typical store associate or a local contractor to build out these projects in such a way that it was fast and easy and intuitive. And so what we do as a company, we are a 3D content management system for the home category. And so I mentioned we're in kitchen, bath, decking, furniture, office, and storage, and they all have the same thing in common, which is you got to take a bunch of individual SKUs, get them into a shared scene, make it an inspiring experience that people want to buy and help them check out. And so historically, if you were going to build one of these projects, you would go find a professional, you'd sit in a store, they'd have like an old off-white beige, desktop monitor, and they'd be flipping through a catalog and, ticking away, and you'd be sitting there for 2 hours sort of just wanting to, pull your hair out, right? And then you'd finally get something, it's not what you wanted, they'd have to do it again, 2 weeks go by, 3 weeks go by, 4 weeks go by, it's just not a great experience. So what we've done is we've built a solution where we can allow you, so imagine that our experience is you scan your space with your cell phone, create a floor plan, select a photo of an inspirational kitchen that you like from a library, that you think of like Pinterest kind of experience. And then our software automatically builds a kitchen in your space based on that design in that photo in about 2 seconds. And so then you can flip through design after design after design after design. You can go through, 50 designs in a few minutes to find what you like. And it's all rules-based, data-driven, using AI. So it's like super simple to go through an experience. And as a homeowner, you don't have to learn the catalog. You don't have to design. You can make some changes if you want to, and then you can submit that to a pro to get your project finished. So we're all about basically automating big ticket, purchases.
Take us back to 2011 when you first founded the company. How did you discover this problem, and what was it about this problem that made you and your brother say, yep, that's it, company number 3, let's go build?
So it actually generated, so we always, like whenever we're going to do anything, we knew it was going to be a content management system, right? So we knew there was going to be like workflow and data, metadata, and application setup, communications, integrations, analytics, white label applications, like any content management system, right? And so we've been always looking, in our first business, the problem was, efficient marketing. And so we were looking kind of actively, like what's the next medium that is going to need, a content management system. And so my brother's background, he's a math, computer science, game guy, love 3D. And so he's like, I really think we should get into 3D. And I'm not that guy. My background's always been retail and data. And so I'm like, well, what's the application in retail? And so the thesis was, man, if you could view a product in 3D, like how much better, this is 2011, right? So augmented reality was not even a word yet. We actually wrote the very first AR app for the App Store back then. And so our vision was, what if you could view a product in 3D? It'd be such a better customer experience. I don't have to depend on what images people share with me. I can look at it from any angle. I can share it. I can combine it with other things. I can change its color or finish. And so our thesis was, which still is, eventually 3D will eat the internet. Every single product on the internet will be in 3D because it's easier to maintain, it's transportable. And so whether it's, dog toys or shoes or whatever, eventually there will be no photos on product pages. It'll only be 3D experiences, especially as the cost of creating 3D gets less expensive. So that was the thesis. And then we started working backwards from that to go, okay, which categories are likely to make that move today? And we found it in 11, and we probably spent 4 years trying to find it. We did fashion and shoes and, luxury items and cars and industrial equipment and healthcare equipment. And then we finally got an opportunity with a decking company and did our first web-based 3D experience. And it was like, boom. And it was this confluence of like, okay, once I create those 3D models, that they're going to stay, the shelf life is going to be a decent time, right? So think kitchens, decking, it's like they don't change out that much, maybe once every couple of years. And then there's a configuration problem to solve and a visualization problem to solve. And so that was like, okay, this is the place we want to play. And then we said, let's focus on the home. And so we've kind of gradually moved into more and more categories in the home. But our ambition is still to be the 3D content management system for all of e-com. But the product market fit for some of the other categories is like still not quite there yet. I mean, you really need to see a shoe in your hand before you buy it. Plus the cost of creating that content, the turnover of that content doesn't quite make the economics work, but eventually it will, right? When it's basically free to create 3D, but it's not there yet. So in the home right now, we'll expand beyond in time.
In the early days, when you started sharing that thesis, were there any people that just doubted that and said, this isn't going to be relevant for the internet? People aren't going to need this? Because like you said, that was still very early in, right? Like the iPhone was released maybe a year before. So it was like very, very early on in this whole shift, I think, right?
Yeah. So our fundraising, maybe pepper in a little bit of our fundraising approach. So we've always raised money from high net wealth former founders and entrepreneurs. We've never really raised money from financial entities like a VC. I do have some folks in, but like they're folks that I know and also were former operators. And part of that was just because that's kind of the world I knew and the people I knew. And part of it was I just didn't really understand, we weren't VC guys, right? I wasn't in Silicon Valley, right? Where it was like very popular. And so it's funny when you get investment from those kinds of people, it's not to say that they don't care about like what you're going to do. They definitely are people who like bet on founders versus ideas. And, and I think they're realistic about the fact that like we were wrong for 5 or 6 years about which category to go into before we found our hook. So, I encourage a lot of people, like if you can do it, like find a family fund that is financed by a former entrepreneur who understands operations and is patient, especially unless your business model is like fully baked out and you're ready to go, like you're going to need somebody who's can mentor you and be patient.
This show is brought to you by Frontlines Media, a podcast production studio that helps B2B founders launch, manage, and grow their own podcast. Now, if you're a founder, you may be thinking, I don't have time to host a podcast. I've got a company to build. Well, that's exactly what we built our service to do. You show up and host, and we handle literally everything else. To set up a call to discuss launching your own podcast, visit frontlines.io/podcast. Now, back to today's episode.
5 years is a long time to really find that product market fit and find that category that would work in. How did you stay so patient to see that through for 5 years? A lot of the founders I talk to, the time scale they're looking at like months, maybe even quarters, but not 5 years until it really seems to grab hold there. So what did you do to see that process through for such a long period of time?
Yeah, I mean, it's not what you really like want, but I would argue that in most cases, that's what's real. We tend to hear the quick hit stories, and that's not like when you take a product to market, you're basically like my brother used to say, talks about like you're making a proposition to the market, right? And the real work is like listening for what comes back to you. And it takes time. People got to tell you their deep, dark problems. And, usually they're nuanced and hidden, and you got to like suss all that out, right? So it probably took 3 or 4 years in our first company. So I just expected to some degree it wasn't going to be right away. We were very frugal with our cash. We, didn't overhire before we felt like we had product market fit. We also started a whole nother company at the same time that helped finance this company. There was a little bit more of a kind of consulting web mobile agency that was a little more like a cash business. So yeah, I wish it had gone faster, and we probably wouldn't have had to raise the money we have raised as much anyway, but I don't know, you better be, like to me, I just think that's the reality of the grind. You're going to have to, to really create something, you're going to have to do that. If you get lucky, great, but I don't know very many guys that I know who've, been lucky out of the box like that.
What are some things that really come from Silicon Valley when it comes to company building that you just read in the news or see online that you really strongly disagree with?
I know a lot of great venture capital, growth equity, private equity folks. Like the issue for me is, and I mean, this is kind of, people talk about this all the time, so it's not like a new topic, but you take investment and these things aren't always going to turn out, a 10 times winner, right? Some are going to be 3, 4, 5 times, but unfortunately, I think those companies end up getting shuttered before they can be, meaningful businesses. I just think it's it has to be by definition based on their business model, kind of a winner take all strategy, which I get. But that's a really stressful way to run a business if I were a founder of a completely venture backed company. Just feeling like it, like the clock's ticking all the time. It just doesn't feel comfortable to me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What about your market category? Is it 3D product experience, 3D product visualization? What's that actual product category?
Just got named, which is funny, that it's now called 3D commerce is our space. So buying things through a 3D enabled experience. That just got coined a couple of years ago.
Was that a Gartner term?
I don't know where it came from. I like it. It's kind of cool, like e-com, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we just started the 3D Commerce Summit last year, February. So that's the first industry event for our space. So it's pretty fun. Like, yeah, it's cool. It's like we're right there, where all the terms are starting to be created around this category, but it's still pretty new.
In that conference, is that something that you organized and you put together?
We did. There were some events, like there's the VR, ARA, virtual reality, augmented reality, but that was which is a great show, but it's too broad. And then they had some stuff at CES. They did some stuff at NRF and the retail show in New York, but there really wasn't we started hearing from our retail partners, which are like, Macy's and Lazy Boy, Bob's Furniture, Miller Knoll, that, they started hiring people with roles that were like head of 3D and visualization. And there was even that title is just sort of becoming a thing now. But they would say, oh, I don't know anybody else who has my job. And I go, oh, I actually can introduce you to somebody. So the idea was, and some of these times these roles are in marketing and digital, and sometimes they're in IT. It's really starting their formation is still happening. So we built it as a way to introduce people who had the same, the one person in these companies who had the same job, and turned out to be a great experience. So we're going to keep doing it.
One of my favorite examples of category creation and category design is Gainsight. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but they created the customer success category. And what their founder says is that he observed in the market that there were more and more organizations where people had a job title that was customer success manager, but there was no purpose-built software, there was no community, there were no events, there was nothing for these folks. So that's what they set out to build, and they served this up-and-coming job title. So it sounds like you're in a very similar position where this job title and this whole profession almost didn't even exist until a couple of years ago, and now you can position yourself as that go-to platform for this profession. Is that right?
Yeah, and very much like that customer success. We have a head of customer success on our team, but it's very much a cross-functional role, right? Where almost like a product manager in the sense that you're touching lots of different parts of the organization, trying to help them have like a very customer-centric health, we call it the health report view. If you're the CEO of, our client, well, how would you talk about us, right? That has to be the brain of the success manager. And these 3D commerce roles have a kind of similar, because they work with merchandising, marketing, digital stores. They have this function that's kind of floating around the company, IT. And so they have to have that same kind of product management, influence a lot of different functions.
When it comes to that conference, two questions. One, were competitors invited there?
No, it's funny. We just had that conversation. There's not a ton of people in this space. We compete against traditional desktop software in many cases, like a CAD software, right? Mm-hmm. And, we'd invite those people, but they wouldn't understand what we're talking about. I'm just kidding. That's just a little there are some earlier stage companies that are coming out that I've been pretty impressed by. So we're thinking about that. Does that make sense to start being a little bit more generous? So we'll see what we do there.
Yeah, the reason I asked that's, I have another podcast called Behind the Category that's all about category creation. And we had one founder on there from Terminus, and they created the account-based marketing category. And that was a big part of their strategy, was they did conferences, they did events, and they were bringing their competitors, and they invited competitors to participate. And I did another interview with the CEO and founder of G2, just talking about how categories are created. And I asked him for his number one piece of advice. And that was his number one piece of advice, was go partner with your competitors, do events together, and then use that to drive categories forward. So was curious where you felt that, because I've heard from other founders where they don't want to be anywhere close to their competitors.
Yeah, actually, and there's this guy, Josh Linkner. He's a New York Times bestseller. He started ePrize. It's a big like promotion management company, like interactive promotions online. He did the same thing. He started it and then invited the competition and, tried to help build the industry. It's a pretty large perspective on building a space. Pretty cool.
Yeah, it's one of those things that sounds nice on paper and it makes sense on paper, but I'm sure when you're sitting there, getting ready to send that email to a competitor, I guess it depends too, how competitive it is. If you're in like a life and death fight against them, then it's probably a bit harder. But either way,
right now we got 2 or 3 competitors. We're probably still kind of all trying to eat each other's lunch. So
makes a lot of sense. Second question there was, you don't have to give me exact numbers, but like roughly what was like the cost to put on an event like that? And how did you measure ROI? I talk with a lot of founders who want to do events, but they get scared from the cost and they get scared from measuring ROI. So how did you approach that?
The first thing we did is we faked it, which I think is a great strategy for all entrepreneurs, which is that whenever you're trying to test the market for something, just fake it and see how much interest there is, right? Like, don't build the product, build a video of the product, right? So the first thing we did is we dropped a website and said, we're running this event and said it was invitation only, kind of like you had to sign up. And then we just were trying to see how many people showed genuine interest and then use that. And we were like, okay, well, that's enough to know that we could probably invest. And then we said, okay, if we get a deal out of this, it'll pay for the event, right? And that's enough to make the justification. And then, try to be break even on your first one and then get some confidence and go to the next one. But that's how we did it.
When it comes to growth, are there any numbers and metrics that you can share?
Yeah, so first of all, the most important metric I care about is retention, which I'm sure every other B2B SaaS guy is nodding their head thinking, yeah, of course. And the worst thing you can do is take a client, where the value proposition isn't very strong and you're constantly trying to fill the holes, right? To keep it, it's energy sapping, right? And sometimes if it's not a good fit, you got to move on. So we spend a lot of time up front with our customer success team, with our delivery team, with our head of strategy, making sure it's a good value proposition. They have the ability to pay. They're at a scale that's going to work for them. And of course that drives retention. So that's what I care about the most. So we've got, our net retention's 110 or something like that. I mean, we've got really good retention. And it's somewhat the nature of the model too. Like imagine I onboarded your entire kitchen catalog, like all the business rules and integrations. It's kind of a hybrid between like a enterprise software and a SaaS. It's like the first 4 months are integrations and content, but that buys you a lot of stickiness. And so we break even in the first 4 months, but then it's, highly profitable and high retention after. Yeah, but we've been growing historical growth rate 25% for the last 5-6 years. That was about the right pace. Don't want to, we're not a hockey stick business, right? We're kind of keep building the foundation business.
As I mentioned there in the intro, you've raised over 44 million to date. What have you learned about fundraising throughout this journey?
I think that, first thing, you have to have a lot of respect for the money you're raising, right? I mean, this is people's hard-earned money and you got to understand that you've got a real obligation and you got to treat it like that. At the same time, I think that like I mentioned, working with the family, former entrepreneurs, like I think they have that same perspective. And then it's not always going to be perfect. I think, I don't know, but you've heard that term like radical transparency. We talk a lot on our team, like, if all I hear from good news from you, I can't believe anything you say. Like you've got to be balanced and you got to do the same thing with your investors. Like the moment I have bad news, I just, my brother and I call each other up, like, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And the answer is always the same thing, which is be fast and transparent. And the nice thing too, is if you work with people on your board that you show that kind of respect for, they get it. It's not always easy conversations, but they understand you're going to have wins and you're going to have losses and challenges. And, so to me, of course we care about the money. We need the money to grow and all that kind of stuff. But, the person or people that come along with it are so freaking important. Like they've got to be in your corner. They can't be infighting. They've got to challenge you. I've got this one guy, Ed Wojtaszek, who's on our board, and he's like the person in my life I can't possibly lie to. Like I try sometimes, I'll try to like paint a picture and he's that guy, you're full of shit. And I don't see it that way. And you're like, God damn it, you're right. It's probably not that way. And it's like, you need somebody in your circle that is kind of like the bullshit caller. Because you always do want to, entrepreneurs are optimistic and want to believe everything. But so you just got to be, you're not fooling anybody, right? That's what I'd say. Like, you're not going to raise money and be more clever than, people who made billions of dollars. Like, it's not going to happen. So be transparent, ask for help, be humble, and you got to have a really respectful mindset around it, because they can, those guys will smell if you're not doing the right things or you're hiding information.
Let's imagine that you were starting the company again today from scratch. Based on everything learned so far, what would be the number one piece of advice that you'd give to yourself?
I love the space we're in. I think it's a great space. The best thing to happen in our space, there's a lot of investment in 3D. And then when AI came out, everybody shifted focus to that, which is great. And because it kind of left my space alone, we haven't seen very much money going into our space lately. So that helps us, right? I wish we'd gotten to kind of where we were going to focus faster and didn't have to spend as much money to get there, but I don't know how I would have changed that, right? Sometimes it's just happenstance and circumstance and timing. So it took a while for things to mature. Like, you should have seen me like trying to like tell people what AR was. Like, we called it holograms, product holograms. They're like, what? And it's like, people didn't know how to use it. Like, it was clunky and it was slow. Like, we were early, that's for sure.
Final question now, since we're almost up on time. Let's zoom out 3 to 5 years into the future. What's the big picture vision that you're building here?
So our current decision that we have to make is, do we want to stay focused vertically in the home category and kind of move out in concentric circles, go to like maybe real estate or new home builders? Or do we want to go sideways and start looking at other categories? And so there are pros and cons to each. If the market goes horizontal and 3D catches in other categories, like, that's a big TAM, like almost a measurable TAM, right? If it goes to all categories. But, there's a huge risk variable there, right? Where the home stuff is probably not as big a TAM, but much less risk. And so that's the thing we talk about a lot, which is, are we going to go deep or are we going to go wide? And what data is telling us what we should do.
Amazing. Beck, this has been a lot of fun, but we'll have to wrap here. Before we do wrap, if there's any founders that are listening in and just want to follow along from a company building perspective, where should they go?
Well, so there's not self-promotion, honest comment though. I wrote a book recently. It's got published. It's on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, called Your Good Work Habits Toolbox. And I basically documented the last 10 years of the business and my entire philosophy around team building and culture and dealing with challenging problems, communications, personal organization. And it was really kind of written as I've got twin 18-year-old boys that are now in college. They want to be entrepreneurs. So I kind of wrote it as kind of a passing on, what my dad did to me. And so, yeah, if you want to follow my story, it's all in there, and hopefully it's interesting to you.
Amazing. We'll make sure to link to that in the show notes. Beck, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks, Brett. Appreciate it. Take care.
Keep in touch.
This episode of Category Visionaries is brought to you by Frontlines Media, Silicon Valley's leading podcast production studio. If you're a B2B founder looking for help launching and growing your own podcast, visit frontlines.io/podcast. And for the latest episode, search for Category Visionaries on your podcast platform of choice. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode.